So good morning, everyone. Welcome to this lecture sponsored by the Bundesberliner Stadtführer e.V., the BBS, held by Dr. Jamie Sewell. He's going to be talking to us today about Museum Island, its history, what's going on there, all of the museums, and we're really excited that he took the time to come out and discuss with us today. And we're also thankful for all those who were able to make it, and for all those who weren't. We're able to record the session and it's now on YouTube. So with that, I will turn it over to Jamie, one of our members, and thank you so much.
Okay, welcome everybody. Really nice to see your faces. I'm just going to bring up the slide presentation that I want to then show you guys. Okay. There we go. All righty. So, okay. So first of all, apologies for the title, which would normally describe the contents of the talk. That's difficult in this particular case because rather than telling a single story, the presentation comprises several smaller stories. This has been dictated by my audience of experienced guides. All of you will be familiar with the architecture of Museum Island. Most of you, if not all of you, will have visited the museums, and a few of you will have guided inside the museums. So based on this premise, the presentation is an attempt at telling the stories that you might not know so well, and which you might be able to use as guides, and which, given your broader knowledge of Berlin and German history, might find interesting and entertaining. Of the artifacts on Museum Island, I've had this problem before. I'm not able, just wait 1 second. I've had this problem before, and as much as I'm not able to turn the screen on, so just bear with me for 1 second. There we go. So, in terms of the structure of the presentation, I'm going to give first like a brief architectural summary of Museum Island. Maybe a while since you guys have been down there, but there are a couple of points that are relevant to the later stories. So just to run over a quick resume of the 5 museums architecturally. Of the artifacts in the museums, then the Pergamon Altar, the Ishtar Gate and Nefertiti are the most famous 3, and account for the Pergamon Museum and the Neues Museum being the most visited of the 5 museums. So the biggest chunk of my presentation will be the backstories of these 3 exhibits. You might have questions about the current situation and the future, and I want to address those at the end of the talk as best I possibly can. I personally have a PhD in classical archaeology. Classical archaeology is defined as the archaeology of ancient Greece and Rome. And I will get that explanation out of the way because I will be using this term quite a bit during the talk. And I've guided then on Museum Island, specifically in the Pergamon Museum and the Neues Museum since 2017. So let's just begin with the architectural development. So first, the altars. Note its location directly opposite the palace, Stadtschloss. This reflects the links between the Hohenzollerns and the story of Museum Island. It is the Hohenzollerns who began the collection of antiquities which ended up in the museums. And for the most part, they remained patrons of the museums through to the end of Hohenzollern rule in November 1918. Probably the closest relationship between any of the monarchs and the museums is that of Wilhelm II. Even though the Pergamon Museum opened in 1930, after the end of the dynasty's rule, it was still a German imperial project, as it was conceived actually in the first decade of the 20th century. It is the Hohenzollern who started the collection of art and antiquities in the 16th century in Berlin, and from the 16th to the 19th centuries, it was very common for Europe's ruling elite to collect art and antiquities. The royal houses were in competition with one another in many ways, even in the size of their art collections, which reflected their status and power. It was the Enlightenment, the new focus on science, rational thought, and education, which led to the turning over of private collections to the public in a new museum. In the 19th century, then Friedrich Wilhelm III suggested that the collection should be accessible to the public and placed in a museum. This was not a new idea. The British Museum was founded in 1753, and it was about this time then that Louis XV of France put part of his collection on public display, and the subsequent French Revolution basically turned the whole of the Louvre Palace into a museum to house the entire former royal collection. The competition between Paris, London, and Berlin for art and antiquities continued at a state level and between the museums themselves. For the first museum in Berlin, Carl Friedrich Schinkel spent time in Paris and London studying the architectural form and layout of the museums there, seeking inspiration for his museum design for Berlin. And the result was then the neoclassical Royal Museum, now known as the Altus, which opened in 1830. The fact that the building was constructed in a neoclassical style is an important part of the story. Neoclassicism was born in Rome, inspired by the writings of Johann Winckelmann, a German art historian and archaeologist, partly educated in Berlin, considered the father of classical archaeology. This was the time of the rediscovery of Pompeii and Herculaneum, which had captured the public's imagination. Winckelmann was the first to make the distinction between the art of ancient Greece and Rome. And the book he published in 1764, The History of Ancient Art, stimulated the creation of the new disciplines of classical archaeology and art history, as well as being very influential on Western painting, sculpture, literature, and philosophy. Winckelmann had a decisive influence on the rise of the neoclassical movement during the late 18th century, which coincided with the Age of Enlightenment, an important element of which was architecture, namely the recreation of the architecture of ancient Greece and Rome. So the Royal Museum is an important example of the resulting architectural style of neoclassicism. The interior dome is modeled on the Pantheon in Rome, underlying the allegory of the structure as a temple dedicated to art. Initially, it exhibited old master paintings, prints, and drawings on the upper floor, and classical sculpture from ancient Greece and Rome on the ground floor. In 1841, King Friedrich Wilhelm IV announced in a royal decree that the entire northern part of the Spree Island, now known as Museum Island, quote, be transformed into a sanctuary for art and science, unquote. And so the collection grew and further museums opened due to the increasing curiosity of German scholars, the willingness of the state to make funds available for further research, and the continuing competition with the also growing collections of Britain and France. The second museum to be built, opened in the mid-19th century, was the Neues Museum, designed by Stüler, again in neoclassical form, but also under the influence of Renaissance revival styles. As it was a second museum to be built, it quickly came to be known as the Neues Museum, leading to the original Royal Museum now to be known as the Altus, Old Museum. And of course, these are the names by which both museums are known today. The Neues Museum was destined for the display of prehistoric, medieval, and Egyptian artifacts, which is still its primary function today. Commissioned by Prussian King Friedrich William IV, begun in 1862, completed in 1876, was the National Gallery by the same architect as the Neues Museum, Stüler, which was at the time destined for modern art, which at the time was then painting of the 18th and 19th centuries, still the focus of the collection today. its form simulating the architecture of Roman temples with the gigantic equestrian statue of Prussian's Friedrich Wilhelm IV before it, in imitation of a Roman emperor, reflects the ongoing intertwined relationship between the museums and their royal patrons, perhaps the most striking example of a museum literally designed as a temple dedicated to art. At the tip of the island is the Bode Museum, completed in 1904, commissioned by Kaiser Wilhelm II and built by Ernst von Ihner between 1898 and 1904, in the architectural style of Baroque revival. And the popularity of Baroque revival is a theme intertwined with the story of Museum Island. In 1956, the museum was renamed after its first director, Wilhelm von Bode, and today houses a collection of sculpture from late antiquity to the 18th century, together with the Byzantine art collection and the new numismatic collection. And just note that there was an earlier and short-lived version of the Pergamon Museum, which opened in 1901. It was, I believe, destined to be temporary and was cramped inside and criticized. It was torn down 7 years later in 1908 to make way for the new Pergamon Museum, the construction of which began already in 1910, but of course was not completed until 1930. And the 20-year delay was the result of the First World War, the November Revolution, and hyperinflation, all decent excuses the new airport does not have. So the current Pergamon Museum was completed in 1930. As well as the Pergamon Altar, the museum came to house the growing collection of important architecture from the Near and Middle East, the most important element of which was the Ishtar Gate of Babylon, which once counted as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And with the basic narrative of the architecture out of the way, let's turn to the backstories of the 3 artifacts, Pergamon Altar, Ishtar Gate, and Nefertiti. And to keep you on your toes, I'm approaching them in the reverse chronological order of their manufacture, beginning with the altar. Now, the Pergamon Museum can be a bit overwhelming for first-time visitors. As you walk from one room to another, you can be stepping from one archaeological site to another, which in reality are hundreds or even thousands of kilometers distant from one another, filled with artifacts that are hundreds or even thousands of years older or younger than the material in the previous room. Only a few of the inscriptions have translations. It's a bit bewildering. This is why at the beginning of a tour of the Pergamon, I try to help the guest establish some kind of familiarity with the displayed material by being deliberately reductive. I tell people not to worry about not being able to read the monumental inscriptions because in a sense, many of them are very, very similar indeed. And similarly, most of the monumental architecture in the museum was built for the same reason. It's what I describe as the insecurity of kingship or rulership. Many of the large monumental inscriptions on the ground floor of the Pergamon in its current state were set up by kings. And the contents of the inscriptions are generally very formulaic. They list the king's achievements, conquering land, killing enemies, bringing about social justice and economic prosperity for their subjects. So, for example, in the reconstructed Neo-Assyrian palace room on the ground floor of the Pergamon, there is this inscription in Akkadian cuneiform, and at least the beginning of it translates as such. So, Ashurnazirpal II, attentive prince, worshipper of the great gods, ferocious dragon, conqueror of cities and entire highlands, king of lords, encircler of the obstinate. I have no idea what that means, but it sounds fantastic. Crowned with splendor, fearless in battle, merciless hero, and you get the picture. Okay. The kings only remained in power so long as they were not overthrown by someone more popular. To avoid this, they put a lot of effort into reminding everyone around them of their legitimacy by broadcasting their deeds in large inscriptions. And one of the things they like to do to keep the people happy was the construction of monumental art and architecture to beautify their cities. And much of this art and even architecture can be found in museums. King Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon was responsible for building the Ishtar Gate. It says so in the inscription set up next to the gate in the museum. In essence, the king in this inscription says, I have built a beautiful gate. There isn't anybody who knows more about building gates than me. And that's another thing, that these inscriptions are always in the first person. I built the gates. But at least in the case of the Ishtar Gate and the processional way, this can be disproven. The people who manufactured the countless bricks from which the monument is made left their marks for posterity in the form of fingerprints of women and children. Anyway, the point I want to make is that the monumental art and architecture was used to legitimate kingship in ancient times. But today, I want to tell the story of how ancient monumental art and architecture was reused in attempts to legitimate kingship once again, but this time it was the Kaiser of Imperial Germany who was seeking legitimacy. So let's turn to the Pergamon altar itself. Notably, it is the altar which inspired the very name of the museum in which it's exhibited, even though in the same museum, one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world is also exhibited, the Ishtar Gate, which is older and more monumental and more completely reconstructed. Why then is the altar so important? And yeah, for the purposes of the story today, there are 3 main elements to why the altar is so important. It is considered to be one of the greatest surviving artistic achievements of the Hellenistic period, and what the Hellenistic period was, we'll talk about in a moment. Its discovery turned the perceived wisdom on the development of art in classical antiquity on its head. The Kaiser exploited the propaganda value of the altar to legitimize the imperial crown and the newly created German Empire. So a little bit of context regarding the altar itself in terms of where it is. The site of Pergamon is today in modern day Turkey on the western coast of Anatolia. So just note that here we have Istanbul located to its north. We have the Aegean here and then Athens. The site itself is spectacular, with the archaeological site perched on a mountaintop overlooking the modern town of Pergamon, which we can see here then in the background. But in antiquity, the city was founded on the hilltop here and went through several stages of expansion over time, so that by the Roman period, let's say by the 1st, 2nd centuries after Christ, the town covered the entire area at the base of the hill, where you can see modern conurbation and even beyond. This is a photograph that I took in 2017. And up on the mountain, the so-called Acropolis, the city was built in a series of scenic terraces. And here the theater, which will be familiar to those of you who have visited the Pergamon panorama. And the altar is located here where the tree is, okay? Right. This is the base of the altar. It was at the time of the excavation here on the left and how it looks today, or 2017. So what is in Berlin in the museum is simply the sculpted reliefs in marble called a frieze that decorated the exterior and possibly interior surfaces of the structure. The marble frieze was not prized off the structure by the archaeologists, but actually found in pieces all over the place within the city. Therefore, the reconstruction depicted here is a guess, and the architecture of the altar has been reconstructed by different people in different ways. And there were definitely some artistic license taken here, because we know that the steps were actually then on, you have to imagine that you have to turn that kind of 90 degrees to the left clockwise, and the steps were then on the other side. We really don't know much about it as a structure. There were many theories about it, but no consensus among scholars on its date, although most agree it dates to the 2nd century BC. No agreement on who built it and why, and what it was used for. There is only one surviving ancient source which refers to it as being an altar. The Pergamon panorama depicts animals being slaughtered in sacrifice on or near the altar, but that is artistic license. Animals may have been sacrificed, but not necessarily so. We have no direct evidence one way or the other. Altars often stood in front of temples, although not always. And although there are some temples up there on the Acropolis, the altar is not clearly associated with any of them. It is sometimes described as the altar of Zeus, because there's a depiction of Zeus in the frieze, but there are depictions of multiple gods and goddesses, so we can't be sure that it was dedicated to Zeus. It is effectively a riddle. That's the state of research in 2020. But important for the story today is that back when the altar was found in the 19th century, the original excavators made up their own minds who built it and why. And there was at that point, as yet, no one to disagree with them. There are two friezes. The smaller one is called the Telephos frieze. It tells the story of Telephos, who was the mythical founder of Pergamon, and the original is currently on display in the Pergamon panorama. It might have decorated the upper part of the altar, but any reconstruction is guesswork. The main frieze, which is not on display at the moment, depicts a gigantomachy, namely a mythological battle between the Olympian gods and giants. This is the Athena in the midst of the battle. The giants have human form, some have wings, and snakes as lower legs. Okay, so that's the altar described. Now on to why it's so important, despite the fact that we know so little about it. Now, at the time the altar was constructed in the 2nd century BC, Pergamon was the capital of an eponymous kingdom at the height of its regional power and influence, a so-called Hellenistic kingdom. After Alexander the Great died in 323 BC, the empire he had formed was broken up into individual kingdoms with their own kings called Hellenistic kingdoms, and Pergamon was one of them. It was in fact a German, Johann Gustav Droysen, seen here contemplating a trip to the hairdresser, who in the mid-19th century in his classic work Geschichte des Hellenismus, the history of Hellenism, coined the term Hellenistic to refer to and define the period when Greek culture spread in areas of the Near East, Egypt, and Asia that had been conquered by Alexander. The Hellenistic period is a period which dates from the moment Alexander the Great died in 323 BC through to when the Roman Empire began, roughly 30 BC. When Droysen coined this term, the history of classical art, namely the Greek and Roman art, was still largely understood through the framework of Johann Winckelmann's hugely influential 18th century work on the development of classical art, a work which had inspired contemporary Western painting, sculpture, literature, and philosophy, and of course, neoclassical architecture, of which the Altus Museum is an important example. Winckelmann's central thesis was that the quality of ancient art increased in accordance with the sophistication of civilization itself, reaching its absolute high point under the democratic system of Athens in the 5th century BC and embodied in artworks such as the Parthenon frieze. For Winckelmann, the quality of art subsequently went into decline when ancient Greece lost its freedom in 338 BC to the king of Macedonia, Philip II, who was none other than the father of Alexander the Great. Much of the Greek world then found itself under the yoke of kingship of the Macedonians, then Hellenistic kings, and subsequently under further monarchs in the form of Roman emperors, followed by the collapse of classical civilization under medieval kingship. Winckelmann argued that societies living under kings were more artistically constrained than those living under democracy, leading to an inevitable decline in the quality of art. Winckelmann's argument became orthodoxy until the Pergamon altar was discovered. Importantly, in this regard, the first fragments of the Pergamon altar clearly dated to the Hellenistic period were discovered by the German art engineer Karl Humann in the very same year as the German Empire was founded under Kaiser Wilhelm in 1871. The German Empire was, of course, a new territorial state based on kingship. And in the early days, it was a bit wobbly in terms of its structure and how power was distributed. Bismarck was basically winging it at the beginning. In these circumstances, one can imagine that anything that brought legitimacy to the new empire would be very welcome indeed. With the discovery of the larger panels of the Pergamon altar in 1879, Humann declared very excitedly that, quote, he had found an entirely new epoch of art, unquote. Why did he think this? In terms of the quality of the realism of the altar's sculpture, it was and largely still is considered to be of higher quality, arguably, than anything previously discovered from the Greco-Roman period. Winckelmann considered the sculptures of the Parthenon in Athens to be among the greatest achievements of Greek art. Yet the sculptures of the Parthenon, the sculpture of the Parthenon is formal and restrained when compared to the Pergamon frieze, which reveals an intense and exaggerated way of expressing movement. The deeply carved bodies intermingle with each other and seem to walk outside the frame of the frieze. The Pergamon frieze, therefore, seemed to contradict Winckelmann's dictum. It seemed now that the absolute pinnacle of art was achieved under kingship, not democracy. Soon after the discovery of the altar, the popular 19th century interpretation regarding who and why it was built was that it had been commissioned by the king of Pergamon, Eumenes II, to give thanks to the gods for his victory in his war against the Gauls, a theory which is still supported by some today. There was sound logic in this interpretation. The Pergamon frieze depicts the mythical battle between Olympian gods and giants. The Greeks employed mythical struggles in art as allegories to their earthly struggles. We know, for example, that the Athenians commissioned the sculptures on the Parthenon, which also depict mythical battles between gods and mythical creatures, to celebrate their victory over the Persians in the 5th century BC. Eumenes of Pergamon had recently defeated the Gauls, and so had the altar commissioned to celebrate his deliverance and victory, but at the same time to deliberately establish a parallel with the sculpture of the Parthenon. It was already known that in the 2nd century BC, Pergamon Athens enjoyed close diplomatic ties. Meanwhile, back in Berlin, the allegory found fertile ground, as the new German Empire had also just been created as a result of victory over the Gauls, namely the French defeated in the Franco-Prussian War. Karl Humann wrote that at the very moment he discovered the figure of Zeus in the Pergamon altar, there were 7 mighty eagles circling overhead. The eagle is the symbol of Zeus, but might these be Prussian eagles instead? And so the wheels of the propaganda machine began to turn. For the Jubilee exhibition of the Royal Academy of Arts in the exhibition grounds next to the Lehrte railway station in Berlin in 1886, the facade of the Temple of Zeus in Olympia was reconstructed, below which a copy of the Pergamon frieze was set up. It was described as the Pergamon Temple. In case there should be any doubt about who, along with the King of Pergamon, was being glorified in all of this, a large obelisk in front of in honor of Kaiser Wilhelm I had been erected in the space directly in front of the Pergamon Temple. The high point of the show was the so-called victory parade, the King of Pergamon, in which 1,500 extras took part dressed up as soldiers from Pergamon with their Gallic prisoners. This alluded directly to the Prussian victory parades over the French, which passed through the Brandenburg Gates in 1814 and 1871. And during this show, a herald proclaimed, "Barbarians threatened empire and land. The king struck them down with an iron hand. And now he returns home by victory crowned, while the cheers of his people joyfully resound. And in 1888, a medal was struck with the head of the emperor on one side, the new Emperor Friedrich III, and the head of Eumenes II on the other side. The medallion also proudly proclaimed that it had been struck on metal derived from the ore of Pergamon itself. The Pergamon altar also had an impact on late 19th century architecture and art. Johann, a professor in art history at the time, conceded that the powerful realism of the Pergamon sculptures was much closer to what he described as, quote, our modern sensibility, unquote, than almost all other works of ancient art. The sculpture of the altar was very similar to the Baroque art of Michelangelo or Andreas Schlüter or even Rubens. As a result, the term Hellenistic Baroque was going to describe it. And it just so happened that at the time the altar was discovered, Baroque architecture was making a comeback in Germany, for it recalled the architecture of 18th century Prussia under Frederick the Great, when Prussia burst onto the European stage and became Europe's fifth greatest military power. Neoclassical architecture was falling out of fashion. Classical and neoclassical architecture is governed by the principles of the dependency of the outer form of architecture on the inner structural core and harmonious system of proportions epitomized by a central plan. Baroque architecture is said to imitate the effects of painting and is only concerned with the psychological effects of form and is essentially illusionistic. It has been argued that the discovery of the altar and its Hellenistic Baroque sculptural style was thus a catalyst in a move away from the Winckelmann-inspired neoclassical architecture of Schinkel, replaced now by the rising popularity of so-called neo-Baroque or Baroque revival, especially loved by Kaiser Wilhelm II, which manifests itself directly in the architecture and decoration of the Kaiser Friedrich Museum of 1904, or more importantly, the Berliner Dom, completed in 1905. Next to the Ishtar Gate, but just as an aside, we'll finish with the Pergamon altar at this point, but just to note that the Pergamon altar directly inspired Speer's early contribution to Nazi architecture, namely the Haupttribune of the Zeppelinfeld in Nuremberg. So now to Babylon and the Ishtar Gate. Now, although Babylon is a long way from Pergamon, one thing that links both sites is that at the time of their excavation, they were both within the Ottoman Empire. In fact, most of what is on display at the moment in the Pergamon Museum, whenever it reopens, is material from the Ottoman Empire. During the 19th century, Germany's ties with the Ottoman Empire had grown on diplomatic and economic levels. Prussian military advisors had assisted in the modernization of the Ottoman army. Trade between the Ottoman Empire and Germany had increased dramatically. And in 1899, Germany was awarded the contract to build a railway from Konya here through to Baghdad, okay? The increasingly warm relationship between Germany and the Ottoman Empire in the later 19th century also paved the way for German archaeologists to excavate there. There were various agreements that were made between the two sides, but generally, often it was like a 50-50 split, with half going to Istanbul or Ankara and the other half coming to Berlin. At this time, the region was becoming increasingly interesting for archaeologists. During the 18th century, it was believed that the source of Western civilization was ancient Greece and Rome. During the 19th century, however, it was slowly being realized that civilization was older and came from further east, and that Greek civilization owed much to Near Eastern cultures. These days, it's considered that the most important cultural developments linked with the term civilization, at least for Europe, came from a large swathe of the Middle East and Near East, now known as the Fertile Crescent or the cradle of civilization. Innovations such as the invention of farming, the earliest cities, the invention of the wheel, the first writing systems, the invention of glass, the common use of both bronze and iron also seem to have spread from this region. I could go on. Babylon was a big archaeological prize because in the early 6th century BC, when the Ishtar Gate was constructed, Babylon was the largest city in the world, with perhaps as many as 200,000 inhabitants, covering an area of up to 900 hectares. The Ishtar Gate was the primary entrance to the city on its 18-kilometer long set of concentric fortifications, equipped with hundreds of towers and a gigantic moat. The gate and the fortifications were famous already in ancient times and were described by some writers as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Some trial excavations were carried out by the German archaeologist Robert Koldewey, initially financed directly by James Simon, the Berlin-born German Jewish textile entrepreneur. Koldewey's assumption that he had found ancient Babylon fascinated the Jewish patron. Simon realized that he could not finance large-scale excavations at Babylon from his private fortune, and thus he had the idea to found the German Oriental Society. Simon succeeded in inspiring several wealthy, like-minded people, such as the banker Franz von Mendelssohn, to fund the archaeological exploration of the Middle East and Near East. Effectively, the German Orient Society, set up in 1898, was set up to excavate within the Ottoman Empire. Kaiser Wilhelm himself would go on to become the patron of the German Orient Society in 1901. He made personal financial contributions to its activities, making the Germany the first country in the world to conduct state-sponsored archaeological excavations. Wilhelm himself was a passionate archaeologist. He was only 19 when he participated in his first archaeological excavation at Saalburg, one of the Roman forts on the Rhine, where he actually discovered Roman artifacts at his first attempt, which in fact had been deliberately placed there by the archaeologists in advance for the prince to find. But as monarch, his interest in archaeology was also political, as the great colonial powers were in competition with one another to find favorable areas for excavation with the aim of enriching their museum collections in their capital cities. Already in 1898, the year of the German Orient Society's founding, Wilhelm II has visited the Ottoman Empire on a 6-week trip, starting in Constantinople, then on to Damascus, Beirut, and Jerusalem. The trip was dressed up as a pilgrimage to Palestine, but it was also designed to emphasize the national presence of Germany in the Middle East, even though much of the trip had been organized by the Thomas Cook Travel Agency in London. It also allowed the Kaiser to indulge in his passion for uniforms. A whole new range of khaki tropical uniforms with tropical helmets had been designed for himself and many of his entourage, from generals to footmen. It was quite an entourage as well. From Haifa to Jerusalem, it included about 100 coaches, thousands of Turkish troops, hundreds of staff, and last but not least, 10 guides. The Kaiser's interest in ancient civilizations of the Near East was also related to his own kingship. When he ascended to the throne in 1888, he seems to have felt himself threatened by the rise of constitutions, parliaments, socialism, and the shadow of the fame of Bismarck. His response was to focus on legitimacy through the divine right of kingship. Time and again, he claimed to owe his royal and imperial authority to divine grace, and hence to be accountable only to God, and not to ministers or parliaments, nor even to the people. At the end of the 19th century, the Enlightenment was fading out of memory. Back in the 18th century, Frederick the Great used to present himself as the first servant of his state. Wilhelm instead claimed, quote, "I am the sole master of Germany and my country must follow me wherever I go," unquote, which was quite a bold statement for an emperor who spent more than half of his reign on holiday. Wilhelm II argued in 1903 that God had directly guided mankind through specific historical persons. Wilhelm's list of historical and biblical characters in whom he believed God had revealed himself is illuminating. His grandfather, Kaiser Wilhelm the Great, Immanuel Kant, Goethe, Shakespeare, Luther, Charlemagne, Homer, Abraham, Moses, and, importantly for our story, Hammurabi, king of Babylon and lawgiver, who left us the oldest complete set of laws known in the world at some 3,800 years old. A copy of the Stele with its 282 laws is set up in the Pergamon Museum, with the original, sadly, in the Louvre. Seen in this light, Kaiser Wilhelm II, volunteering himself to become the patron of the German Orient Society in 1901, takes on another light. He wanted to collect proofs and symbols of divine kingship, and he remained interested in studying forms of ancient Oriental monarchy throughout his life. Even in exile in Dawn in 1938, he published a book on sacred kingship in ancient Mesopotamia. From the archaeologist's point of view, Wilhelm's fascination with the ancient Near East, while he was still Kaiser, translated into finance for excavation. Large-scale excavations in Babylon began in 1899 and continued until the First World War. With up to 250 workers at his disposal, Koldewey initially focused on the area of the Ishtar Gate, moving layers of soil up to 24 meters thick that covered the remains. Babylon suffered from a lack of decent building stone. Most of the gigantic walls were made from simple mud brick, which had long since collapsed before being excavated. The Ishtar Gate and its associated processional way were made out of brick that had been fired in a kiln at a high temperature. This led to their survival, but they had broken into fragments. About 300,000 fragments were gathered up by the excavation team. The first crates with the brick fragments arrived in Berlin already in 1903. And after desalinating and waxing, the next question was how to reconstruct the gate from all of these tiny bits. The job of the reconstruction was given to the German archaeologist Walter André, who from 1928 presided over the 2-year process of desalinating and reconstructing the Ishtar Gate and the processional way. A significant number of replica bricks were also used that were produced specifically for that purpose. I've read that about 40% of the bricks are replicas. I get the feeling it might be more. André commissioned a workshop outside of Berlin to produce Babylonian enamel colors for the reconstructed bricks, actually according to a recipe found in an inscription on one of the original bricks. But in terms of the design, what was the basis for André and his reconstruction? Effectively, it was imagination and informed interpretation. André had had an attempt at a design already back in 1907. He'd been the set designer for the pantomime called Sardanapal, performed in 1908 in what is now the Staatsoper, based on the Neo-Assyrian ruler Ashur-banipal. The staging of the piece had been initiated and supervised by the Kaiser himself, to be understood in the context of Wilhelm's fascination with Mesopotamian kingship. And despite the efforts made in the production, critics were not appreciative. The morning after the inaugural show, the Vossische Zeitung, a Berlin newspaper, asserted that, quote, "The Assyrian ballet Sardanapal is so boring that anyone who lasts to the end receives Order of the Crown 3rd class," unquote. It was André's first attempted reconstruction of the architecture of the Near East. And when later André came to reconstruct the Ishtar Gate for the Pergamon Museum, one of the authors I have read on this theme states that, quote, "He clearly conceived the museum reconstruction as an opera stage, making no significant distinction between an ephemeral stage set and a permanent installation," unquote. Perhaps, but against André's wishes, the end result was considerably smaller than the original. The architectural plan of the Pergamon Museum predated the decision to display the Ishtar Gate and processional way within it. They both had to be squashed to fit. Consequently, the processional way became much narrower and shorter than the original, and the Ishtar Gate much smaller than André had wanted. Although André's approach was scientifically grounded and methodological, it has been highlighted that some contemporary artistic influences found their way into the reconstruction, especially that of the Babylonian throne room, which is located in the museum directly to the right and to the left of the Ishtar Gate as you look at it. It's been argued that the particular ornamental patterns of the antique fragments chosen by André for the throne room, as depicted here, reflect the contemporary fashion for Jugendstil and Art Nouveau. Of course, the Pergamon Museum opened to great acclaim, but one person who was not at the opening was James Simon, the main founder of the German Orient Society that had initially been set up to facilitate the very excavation at Babylon. The new Pergamon Museum was filled with material recovered from the excavations of the German Orient Society at its opening, and James Simon was invited, but he had returned the invitation. Why? He was born in Berlin into a wealthy Jewish family. He had a good education, learned Greek and Latin, which he excelled at, and he wanted to actually study the ancient world, but his father wanted him to focus on business. As an adult, he made a fortune as a textile entrepreneur, and his wealth allowed him to indulge in his passion for the ancient world. With this money, he helped to finance the excavations of the German Orient Society, and he also bought antiquities and art to create a huge collection. He donated his collection, namely more than 10,000 objects, to the museums in Berlin, including a large number of priceless items such as paintings from Rembrandt and Bellini. In fact, and this is super important, in the late 19th, early 20th century, 90% of all of the artifacts given to the museums from private individuals came from German Jews. He was also a philanthropist as well, donating a vast amount of money for public health in Berlin, for the construction of public bathhouses, homes for abused children, and he financed the emigration of Jews out of Eastern Europe into homes in Germany, the USA, and Palestine. He suffered from the rising anti-Semitism in Germany towards the end of his life. With the opening of the Pergamon Museum, he asked that his benefactions should be officially remembered. The museum broke their promise, and his name was not mentioned. As a result, he returned his invitation to the opening of the museum in 1930. And it's Simon who provides the connection with the bust of Nefertiti, as it was Simon who personally and solely financed the excavation that discovered Nefertiti. The bust is so important because it is arguably the most beautiful and iconic piece of Egyptian art in existence. 3,350 years old, the wife of the pharaoh, stepmother of Tutankhamun, and so unlike any other Egyptian piece of art known, due largely to the natural coloring of the statue, which makes her so lifelike. This is why some have accused the statue of being a fake, but we now know that it cannot be a fake, because only very recently, scientific techniques have developed to the point where samples can be taken from the paint used to analyze the minerals used in the paint. And that is then has been compared with genuine pieces of Egyptian art. And the mineral composition of the paints used is identical. And when the statue was discovered in 1912, it's simply not possible that anyone had the knowledge of reproducing original then Egyptian paint. So this is how we know that it's real. Perhaps less well known is that the archaeologist in charge of Simon's excavation in Egypt, which found Nefertiti, Ludwig Borchardt, was also then a Berlin-born German Jew. The site where Borchardt discovered Nefertiti, Tel al-Amarna, is about 280 kilometers south of Cairo as the crow flies. The site was a short-lived city which existed for perhaps 17 years. So in the middle of the 14th century before Christ. The pharaoh Akhenaten, who ruled in the middle of the 14th century BC, or 3,350 years ago, attempted to radically change Egyptian religion forcibly by, it seems, attempting to change the state religion to the worship of only one god, the Aten, the god of the sun's disk. To emphasize the break with tradition, the pharaoh had an entirely new city built at Tel el-Amarna, which came to be the residence of the pharaoh and his wife, but which was also to be the center of the new cult. After the death of the pharaoh, just 17 years into his reign, the old gods were restored and the new capital was quickly abandoned to the shifting sands of Egypt. Here in 1912, Borchardt found Nefertiti. Or did he? We went to find out. 4 intrepid Berlin guides, here we have them, from left to right is myself, the indomitable then Michael Dempsey, Mike Stack in the background, part of the audience today, and John O'Leary and 2 of their partners traveled in the footsteps of Borchardt in 2017 and visited Tel el-Amarna. We stood in the very place where Nefertiti was discovered, or at least that's what our local guide told us. To be honest, I have looked at the excavation plans, and if we weren't exactly on the spot, then we weren't far away. But we were told by our guide here on the left that it was actually an Egyptian boy who carried water for the excavation team who found the bust of Nefertiti and brought it to Borchardt. Whether this is true or not, I found it a nice flourish to the story. Looking back with post-colonial hindsight, the stories of the discoveries of the great artifacts of ancient civilizations all have a similar ring to them. Whether Karl Humann and the Pergamon Altar, Robert Koldewey in Babylon, or Borchardt and Nefertiti, these are the stories of white European hero archaeologists who dare to travel to barbarian lands to rescue the treasures of ancient civilizations from contemporary barbarians who did not understand their cultural value. These, in inverted commas, rescued artifacts were then brought back to what was deemed to be the true successors of these ancient civilizations, namely Western Europe and its museums. Attitudes in those days were highly condescending in hindsight, but of course, the hero archaeologists were not the ones who got their hands dirty. They hired local workers to do the actual digging. On our visit to Egypt, we heard several similar stories from local guides. For example, in the Valley of the Kings, we heard that once again, it was a boy who carried water for the excavation who informed Howard Carter where the entrance to Tutankhamun's tomb was. The fact that we heard repeatedly that it was an uneducated child who made the actual discovery is of course so condescending in relation to the white European hero archaeologist in charge, to which one can only say, touché. And it is a reminder that it was the locals who did most of the work. Once the statue was discovered, Borchardt was a bit sneaky and lucky to get it back to Berlin. The deal with the Egyptian Department of Antiquities was that all the finds from the excavation were to be divided 50-50. Half went to Cairo Museum and half went to Berlin. But it was then Borchardt who made the division, literally by making 2 piles of artifacts. In one pile was the bust and the other sculptures from the same workshop. The Department of Antiquities got to choose which of the 2 piles they wanted to keep and made the wrong decision. Because Simon paid for the excavation, he actually owned the material recovered from it. And once it got back to Berlin, he had Nefertiti on his mantelpiece for a couple of years. Simon lent all the Amarna finds to the museum in 1914, and in 1920 donated the whole lot to the museums. The statue was first put on display in 1924. One of the reasons for the delay was Borchardt himself, who tried to stop it being exhibited. Borchardt's fear was that when the statue was put on display, it would cause a sensation. The Egyptian authorities would realize they'd been duped by Borchardt, and he might not get another license to excavate in Egypt again. It is Borchardt's lack of honesty which continues to be used by the modern day Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities as the basis for the claim to have the bust returned. James Simon died in 1932, and the Nazis did their best to eradicate the memory of his contributions. And just to finish then, final section, I just want to go over very rapidly a few of the developments from the Nazi period through to today and beyond. But let's just stick with Nefertiti for a moment. Both Goering and Goebbels wanted to give Nefertiti back already quite early in 1933, but Hitler said no, because Hitler wanted to build a new Egyptian museum on the north bank of the Spree next to Museum Island. And moreover, then the Nazis also planned a German museum, a World War museum, an East Asian museum, and a race museum, all in close proximity to Museum Island. The artifacts started to be brought to safety by the Nazis already in 1939. The most valuable ones were the first to be moved. Nefertiti, for example, in 1939 was first put in the cellar of the Preußische Staatsbank. In 1941, moved to the Flak Tower at Zoo. In March 1945, the bust was moved to a salt mine, Kaiser in Thüringen, where at the end of the war, it was then found by the Americans, following the story of the Monuments Men. It was initially kept and displayed in various places in West Germany, brought back to West Berlin in 1956, and put on display in Dahlem until 1967, and eventually brought to Charlottenburg. Now, regarding the bombing, then you, of course, must all be aware that the museums got bombed, with the Neues Museum coming off worst. Intense fighting in the Battle of Berlin took place in and around Museum Island. The Soviets also arrived in Berlin with a list of stuff that they wanted from the museums of war reparations, which was then taken back to Moscow. The Soviets returned much of what they had taken in the 1950s and the 1970s, but not all of it. Priam's treasure, excavated by Heinrich Schliemann from Troy, is still in the Pushkin Museum in Moscow. But during the Cold War era, the surviving artifacts from Museum Island were split between East and West Germany, and really at this point, nobody had a complete overview of what had survived. Of the island's museums, all of them opened to some degree under the GDR regime, with the exception of the Neues. Since then, reunification, a vast amount of money has been thrown at Museum Island. The process of reintegrating the collection is still ongoing. And then to conclude, what does the present and the future look like? Well, let's just look at recent developments, such as then Yadiga Assisi's Pergamon Panorama, which opened in 2018. I'm personally a huge fan. If you haven't gone, then please do. By the way, interesting to note that this is the third attempt at a Pergamon Panorama in Berlin. The first was in 1886 on the occasion of the Jubilee of the Royal Academy of Art. The second was from Assisi in 2011, which was set up then between the two main wings of the Pergamon Museum. And this then the latest one in 2018. And then, of course, last year, a major step in the recognition of the contribution of James Simon was made in the opening of the James Simon Gallery. At a cost of 134 million euros and nearly 10 years in the building. Think of it what you will from an architectural point of view, but at least by calling it the James Simon Gallery, it goes some way to recognize one of the greatest museum benefactors of all time. The gallery is intended then to be the central hub for Museum Island. So this is a recent satellite photograph. We have then the James Simon Gallery here. I guess the majority of you will be aware that as it is at the moment, then it provides an entrance to the Pergamon Museum on the western end of the southern wing here. And if you go downstairs, it will take you then into the Neues Museum. The idea is that there's, in the end, an archaeological promenade will be set up. So via underground passages, you'll be able to get then into the old museum. And then you'll also be able to get into the Pergamon Museum via what is described as the Tempietto, which is located here. Onwards, then you'll through tunnels, you'll be able to get then through to the Bode Museum. In terms of timing of all of this, I don't know. I've heard various things from informal conversations with staff. Officially, the Pergamon Museum, the Pergamon Altar, sorry, will be on display once again by 2024. That will be then the opening then of the tunnel, which will take this through to the Pergamon Altar, which will be located there. And as soon as that happens, then the wing that we are familiar with at the moment here, that is going to shut. And everything within it will go through then renovation. And if you look at this aerial photograph, you can see that the temporary roof put over the northern wing means, I guess, that they're replacing the entire roof, which will then happen then to the southern wing as well. So my suspicion is that once the Pergamon Altar becomes visible again, let's say hypothetically by 2024, then the Ishtar Gate and the Near Eastern collection, and indeed the Islamic art collection in the upper story, that is going to go offline for an unknown period of time, but I'm guessing probably for more than a decade. That would be my guess as such. So I'll finish there. I think let's stop the share. And then Heather, if you can allow people to have turn on their microphones if they wish, and then we'll see if we have any questions.
Sure. First of all, that was spectacular. Thank you so much, Jamie. I think it might be wise for me to stop recording, and then I'll go ahead and open the floor for questions. Or would you prefer, Jamie, that the recording continue?
I have no problem with the recording continue. You can always delete it at the end in case Mike starts swearing or, you know.
Okay, then I'll indeed keep it recording. And there were a few questions that Jerry had written during your presentation. I don't know if you want to take a quick look at that. And okay. I will go ahead and unmute everyone. I think.
Yeah, so was Nefertiti owned by James Simon? Initially, yes. So he had paid for the entire excavation at Tel Amana, so therefore all of the stuff that was brought back was then his initially, but then he lent the finds in 1914 and donated the whole lot then in 1920.
I have a question.
Sure.
Now, the first picture you showed of the Altis Museum, there were some equestrian statues standing by the stairs. And, you know, now we have this female warrior defeating a lion and then a male warrior defeating a lion. And this weird thing is I saw exactly the same statues when I went to the Metropolitan Museum in Philadelphia. I don't know, do you know anything about these statues?
The statues came later and they didn't come together either. They came at different times, but as far as I can see, the image which I've got is, let's just bring it up.
There's some guys on horses on the picture.
Yeah, I think it's, to be honest with you, I think it's actually yeah, oh, I see what you mean. We don't have the mythical beast there as such. Yeah. No, as far as I'm aware, then that's the artistic license. I don't think there were any other earlier statues there. I think that's just somebody who was getting out of the added complication of adding the beasts.
Ah, okay. So I mean. the original didn't have these statues of.
Yeah, I think that's an attempt at recreating the statues that we see there, but they didn't add the beasts. Yeah.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
And do you know why there are copies of those statues in Philadelphia?
No idea.
Yeah, it's a bit weird.
Absolutely no idea. Okay.
Did James Simon ever visit the excavations during his life?
He definitely did go there. I think maybe as announced. Trying to trawl through my memory. I think he went there prior to the excavation starting. I think he was inspired from his visit to want to finance the excavations there. Whether he actually was there at the same time as Borchardt, I'm not sure, but I pretty certainly visited the site. Anybody else? Yes.
Yeah, Jamie, go. I was wondering, because you mentioned Winckelmann, and explained about his important influence on the definition of classical archaeology or even invention. So is his role also acknowledged in the English-speaking world?
Oh yeah, very much so. I mean, as the inventor of classical archaeology, he can't be overlooked effectively. And archaeology today is seen quite differently, in as much as then there were effectively two branches. We have the classical archaeology, which is very much based on art history, and then archaeology, which looks at like early human development, prehistory, and so on, kind of comes from an anthropological perspective. And the art historical focus of classical archaeology is something which still dominates today. Even that is then derived from Winckelmann. Also, and it has been acknowledged, the people that I mentioned, whether Walter André or Koldewey, also were architects and extremely skilled artists as well. And so the German influence on classical archaeology is also in relation to the architectural focus as well, is very much recognized too. So although classical archaeologists now employ all kinds of other scientific methods and looking at all kinds of different aspects of ancient society, whether it be economy, and the notion of empire and politics and so on, but still then the art historical side is still very important, and it's acknowledged. This comes, all works on classical archaeology begin with Winckelmann. Yeah, somebody had
Jamie.
Yeah.
You said that around 40% of the pieces of the Ishtar Gate are replicas. Was that right?
That is what I've read, and I had that figure in my head as I walked around the museum, but just looking at it, my sense is that it's more than that. That seems to me it'll be a low figure, but that's the only attempt at giving it a number that I've ever read.
Right.
I feel that that's an underestimate.
So, and I guess that's what leads me to my question then. Like, what kind of visual evidence leads you to believe that there is more, like outside some of the the most obvious?
I think if you look at the upper part of the register, so for example, with the Ishtar Gate itself, when you stood in front of it, it's really only the animals. The animals are the original ones. Well, Andre, in his reconstruction, he wanted to make sure that everyone could see what was original and what was reconstruction. So you can see like the fractures between the individual fragments, he's left clear. And so if you look up close, you can see quite clearly what is original and what is reconstruction. And it's for the gate itself, it's largely the animals, which are the original bits, and the rest of it is reconstruction, which is then by far the majority. It's a bit difficult with the throne room, because on one side the throne room contains much more original parts than on the other side, and then it's difficult to get an overview looking in the processional way. You have to kind of look up and so on, and so it's just an impression I have that overall it's more than 40%.
Okay, good, thanks.
Okay.
There's also another question over here in the chat.
Oh yeah, sure.
Susan asked an interesting question here about Nefertiti ever being returned to Egypt. Curious to hear your opinion on that.
On artifact restitution. Thank you for your comments, Susan. Yeah, but I tend to stand back a little bit in this. Whether she will be returned to Egypt or not, I don't know. I don't want to second guess what. There's certainly no signs of it at the moment. I kind of stand back and look at then all of these arguments. Being British, of course, then the Elgin marbles return from the British Museum is like a big theme. There, I visited then the Acropolis Museum together with Mike, in fact, and they've left a big hole where the Elgin marble should be returned. And for me, clearly, then the Acropolis Museum is much better equipped to display the Elgin marbles than the British Museum is. But the arguments are always the same. The people who have the stuff say it's better where it is. The people who want it back say it's better to give it back. And they intellectualize it in all kinds of different ways, but that's always the same result. My view is that as long as it's safe and is visible to the public, those are the two main considerations, that above all else, that it should be that. But the definition of what's safe is then, different from person to person. So it will continue to be ongoing, the arguments. I'm prepared to stick my neck out in terms of my opinion. My opinion has changed now. I think that Britain should give back the Elgin marble. So like 5 years ago, I didn't have that opinion, but I do now. So I've been to the Acropolis Museum. Whether Nefertiti should be given back, I've also been to the museum in Cairo. There's a new museum in Cairo which may at some point open. I'm not sure when, but the old museum in Cairo, anyone who's been there, it's a bit distressing because very, very unlike the museums in Berlin, visitors are allowed to basically put their hands on whatever they want. And especially if you have experience with the guards in the museums on Museum Island, is a huge contrast to see people stroking the various artifacts. And of course, you don't want to do that with Nefertiti. So as long as they can be safeguarded, then it's that, and on display for the public, that for me is the most important thing.
I think Ryan might wanted to have asked something.
Hey.
Or am I putting you on the spot, Ryan?
I think I wanted to say something. I don't know.
Hey, Jamie.
Can I just let Ryan and then go
I'm so sorry. I thought he was saying he didn't want to ask questions. Sorry.
No, my microphone wasn't working. Jamie, I just had a quick question about something you said about post-war Berlin and the division of artifacts.
Yeah.
Do you know much about how that was done, how that was decided?
It was, there wasn't really much, there certainly wasn't any joint decision making as far as I'm aware. So you just got the situation that the monuments men fathers find this gigantic pile of stuff in this salt mine, Kaiser, including then also the caskets of Frederick William I and Frederick the Great, which were found there as well. And then that stuff, the stuff that had come from Museum Island then made its way back to Berlin at various points during the Cold War era. We have then the Soviets taking loads of stuff and then giving a huge amount of it back, but not all of it. And so that part of the collection ends up in the East. What was found then by the Americans end up in the West. And then it was only after reunification that they began the process of trying to integrate the two collections. And that is a process which is still ongoing. So we went to visit the archive, the magazine where it's all stored. And of course, they've got vast quantities of stuff, which was then destroyed in the bombing. So the fire bombing, you've got, whether it's ceramic or metal that is then twisted and warped through the heating in the fires. We know, for example, like just one bombing raid, the New Museum in February 1945, like 30,000 artifacts were destroyed. And because so many of the records date from the late 19th century and without photographs, they're having to take these artifacts and with written descriptions, trying to figure out, well, that's what they've got. And so the integration of the collection is something which is then the task of the storerooms and is still ongoing. Torben.
Thank you, Jamie, for the presentation. That was great. And I'm sorry, Ryan, I really didn't mean to interrupt.
No, not at all, no problem.
Yeah. I had two questions about the Ishtar Gate. I remember reading someplace that Koldewey's excavation at Ishtar was new in that he was the first archaeologist to essentially systematically collect and document everything that he excavated instead of sort of discarding the stuff they didn't find interesting or wasn't considered to be of artistic or historical value. And then the other thing I remember reading about it is that I think you mentioned that Koldewey sent a lot of the pieces back beginning in 1903, but I think that he was interrupted with the First World War. And my understanding was that after the First World War, that the British officials who moved into Ishtar essentially called up and said, you've got all these boxes of bricks, do you want them back? And that really only thanks to that either the British not recognizing what they had discovered, or a kind of a collegial consideration, they sent that all to Berlin. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah. So what I'd like to do actually is just bring up something which I forgot to do. And that is then just the final slide with some extra reading in relation to this as well. And then there's quite a bit of stuff on that theme described here. First of all, regarding Koldewey's excavation techniques, yes, is the answer. So he's accredited with his kind of architectural background. He was largely an autodidact, but he was a very, very skilled archaeologist, and he approached it very systematically, and he made a number of innovations in that respect in terms of systematic recording, which was a bit of a benchmark, as you correctly mentioned, Torben. So we have this first bunch of tiles arriving then in 1903. Then indeed the First World War got in the way, and then there are two main batches of stuff from Assyria and Babylonia, which then come back in 1926, 1927. One lot actually made its way to Berlin already in 1914 aboard a ship called the Cheruskia, which then sailed from Basra, took refuge in the harbor at Lisbon in Portugal at the beginning of the First World War, and it had hundreds of crates, hundreds of tons of material well, this is the point. I wanted to actually include that in the story today, but I've read conflicting things, so I'm not really sure. I've had conversations with Mike about this as well. That a lot of the material that was in the Cheruskia was from Ashur, but it also describes then a number of glazed tiles, which I thought were maybe from Babylon, but I'm not so sure. And then the rest of the stuff then remained in Mesopotamia. At the end of the First World War, the British tried to nab the stuff in the Cheruskia. They actually sent down officials who had a background in Babylonian studies to convince the Portuguese that the material on the ship had been excavated illegally and now needs to be returned to the place where it came from, which was Mesopotamia, which of course, after the end of the First World War, was in the possession of Great Britain. So it was a way to try and divert the stuff and get it up to the British Museum. The Portuguese resisted, and the stuff was still there in 1926. And it was some Philo-German professors there that allowed the German Institute to reopen, and that paved the way for the stuff to come back to Berlin, but only in exchange for 300 artifacts in the museums in Berlin that were given to Lisbon. And again, I'm not really sure what they were. I've read that it was like some Portuguese works of art or paintings or antiquities, I'm not sure, but there was some kind of deal. Exactly what was on the ship, I don't think is entirely clear, which leads to the ambiguity. But certainly a lot of stuff from Ashur, which had been excavated by Andre, and possibly glazed tiles from Babylonia as well. And then, yeah, the British archaeologist and incredible character Gertrude Bell intervened then to establish what happened with the material from Babylonia and the other sites excavated by the German Orient Society. And then I think it was 1921 when the state of Iraq was then set up. And so instead of being divided, the Mithvan is to be divided between Berlin and Ankara or Istanbul. They were now divided between Berlin and Baghdad. And there was some arrangement made. I can't get to the bottom of that story, exactly how that happened. I haven't found of any publication which goes into the mechanics of that, just mention it briefly. But that led to then an agreement that the Germans could actually have their stuff. I think part of the problem behind it was that the director of the British Museum was certainly doing writing a lot of letters to important officials, including Churchill, to try and get that material to London. But a international agreement had been signed before the First World War, actually going all the way back to Napoleon and all the stuff that he nabbed, to try and stop stuff being grabbed in during wartime. And although the British wanted it, they had also, as part of the propaganda in the First World War, made a lot of noise about Germany stealing stuff in the First World War. And so it would have been hypocritical for them to do exactly the same after the end of the First World War. And so this is one of the main reasons why Germany got its stuff back. But so, and then the remaining material from Lisbon and then from Mesopotamia, what is now then Iraq at this point, returns back to Berlin 1926 and 1927, and they put everything back together. So yeah, it's a really, really fascinating story. So I'm really glad that you mentioned it.
That's really interesting. Thank you. Maybe just one quick follow-up. You mentioned the Kodabai was an autodidact. I mean, they all must have been, right? I mean, when does archaeology or classical archaeology become a university discipline, right? When is it possible to get a degree in archaeology?
Oh, that's a question I feel I should know, but I don't have in saved in my RAM memory, so I'm not really sure. I mean, there were other people who were. I don't think Kodabai had a PhD, for example, but I think there were. I think Andre was trained as an architect and a draftsman, for example. Kodabai had similar skills, but hadn't actually been officially trained in that sense. So you've got people who are kind of making sideways moves, trained in architecture and graphic design and so on, that move across and apply their skills. When we have people who are properly what we just would describe as professors in classical archaeology who conduct, and when university degrees began, I'm not really sure. I wouldn't want to say anything false in that sense.
Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else?
Yeah, Jamie, real quickly, this is kind of a silly question, but those who wrongly believe, as you pointed out, that Nefertiti is a replica on display, do they think that the real just hasn't been excavated, or is there some other Nefertiti on display somewhere in the world where a museum says, well, hey, no, we actually have the real one here? What do these people think?
No, I think the accusation of it being a fake is simply was based on the fact that it looks so different. It looks so much more real and naturalistic than any other piece of ancient Egyptian art. So it's that stark difference. There doesn't seem to be kind of any in-between steps. It suddenly it stands out as a one-off thing in that respect. But you know, in terms of the copying of Nefertiti, what I've had with visitors to the museum, and say, oh yes, I saw Nefertiti when I was in a museum in the United States, or when I was in Egypt. There's a copy certainly in the Egyptian museum. She is one of the most replicated images and that you can find. I even saw, what was it? Django Unchained, the film. There was like a bust of Nefertiti sitting on the mantelpiece in one of the houses there, like way before even the statue was found. So it's so unbelievably iconic that it is a ubiquitous image that you see all over the place. And there are so many. I found a black and white photograph could only be like a few years after the statue was first put on display, of a workshop, presumably in Berlin, with vast numbers of plaster cast copies of the Nefertiti that were being painted for sale. So yeah, she's this ubiquitous image. Okay.
I think David has a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Heather. And thank you, Jamie, for another fantastic lecture.
Thank you.
My question's about the James Simon Gallery, because I haven't been in there yet. I presume it is now open to the public. I mean, pandemic notwithstanding.
Yeah.
And do you think, what's your general impression of it? Do you think they've done a good job? From what I recall, there's supposed to be some kind of introductory texts to all the museums, or there's the kind of a temporary exhibition relating to one or more of the collections. Just your general impression of how the architecture from outside looks pretty stunning, I have to say. What does it look like on the inside? Do you think they've done a good job in terms of laying out their stock, in terms of pointing people in the right directions to the strengths of the various collections on Museum Island?
Okay, well then it's got ticket place on the ground floor, and if you go up the magnificent steps, then there's a ticket place at the top of the steps, which is actually only for groups. The largest area where you can buy tickets is actually for groups, and that's the area which is often empty. And then if you want to buy a ticket, you actually have at the moment, well, since it opened in July last year, in this very, very narrow space. So I've very often encountered then bottlenecks there, where it's literally not possible to move, which would then give one the impression that it doesn't work very well. But I would have to give it a break, because it's designed for the complete functioning of Museum Island when everything is done, and we're a long way away from that. So at the moment, it's like the only way into the Pergamon Museum. But as far as I understand it, when all of the works is complete, then what used to be the old entrance opposite then Angie's gaff, there will be a bridge over the other arm of the spray, so you can go via that way. So and then also there will be another way into the Pergamon Museum, because you go downstairs in the James de Monts Gallery, and then that will take you up to the Tempietto. So there will be, at the moment, you're kind of funneled into the museum through the James de Monts Gallery, which makes it look really, really cramped. Once everything is done and finished, then it will look different. They've got a great gift shop there. They've got a great looking restaurant, which I don't rate, let's say.
Why don't you rate it, Jamie?
Because food's not very good.
No.
At least when I was there. And then if you go downstairs, there's a large space which is for temporary exhibitions. The last exhibition that was there was Die Germanen, which wasn't very good. And then what you were referring to is like the introduction to the 5 museums. If you go down the stairs to the bottom, to the right, they have the various models and multimedia displays on the history of Museum Island, the development of the architecture and the collections, which is quite well done. And then you go through to the new museum, and they've got 4 vitrines, glass stands, with then introductory objects from the 5 museums, with a brief introduction explaining what they do. And that's quite well done as well, I would say. So I'm a fan, and I'm not a fan at the same time. But I really want to see how if I'm still alive, when it's finished, what it will look like when that's eventually done.
And do we know, just a final quick question, do we know when they're planning to have it all finished?
I don't know. My suspicion is that nobody knows that. But I'm thinking that it's at least a decade, if not decades away.
Okay. Thanks very much, Jamie.
Pleasure.
All right. If there's nothing else, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. Before I do, just one more time, Jamie, that was so fascinating. I really enjoyed it. I know we all did. So thank you so much for your efforts and for doing this for us. And I also personally enjoyed the joke about the airport that you did at the beginning of the presentation. I'm going to hit record, stop recording. And I have one other thing to say regarding the BBS and business, if anyone wants to hang on for a quick moment. So thank you everyone on YouTube who tuned in.